Great.
Text
Okay.
coming in all the time.
Welcome everyone who's joined us. Good evening, and welcome to this joint event with the Young Fabians and the Fabian International Policy Group. We've called it Labour's Trade Policy for a Post-Brexit, Post-COVID World. My name's David. I'm on the Fabian International Policy Group committee. I'm also a member of the Young Fabians, and I work in trade policy for the trade justice movement. So I know Bill reasonably well through that. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Bill Esterson, who's the Shadow Minister for International Trade. He's served on the Labour trade team under Corbyn and Starmer. He's the MP for Sefton Central in Merseyside, post he's held since 2010. So I'll maybe let you introduce yourself a bit more, Bill, and perhaps you could just say a bit about what your role is within the Labour trade team, and anything that you're particularly working on at the moment. And then we'll maybe have, I don't know, maybe half an hour, 40 minutes of discussion and questions just on the panel, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A on Zoom after that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, David, for that very thorough introduction. I don't think I've really got very much to add to what you said. And good evening to everybody who's watching, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. But I'll just start with these thoughts. 45% of our exports go to the European Union. 53% of our imports come from the EU. A further 13% of our exports go to countries because we are members of the European Union, and 12% of imports come from those countries, about 70 countries. Compare that to the United States, which is the next biggest source of trade. 19% of exports go there from the UK, and only 11% of imports come from the States. But I'll ask this question: what is international trade really about? I'll give you 5 things: food, animal welfare, the NHS and public services, workers' rights, the climate crisis, and environmental protections. That's 5 things, because it's about everyday life and what really matters in the world. And the reason is because international trade agreements, which are governed by international law, override domestic legislation. And next week we start the Trade Bill Committee, which is about that very subject. But let's just go through those 5 headings. Food safety, food production. In the United States, food poisoning is 10 times the level it is here. And that's because they allow a level of impurities. So you can find up to 11 rat hairs in a 25-gram pack of paprika. You could find 10 milligrams of rat droppings in 0.4 kilograms of cocoa. There are maggots in orange juice, and they're allowed to have a small number of fly fragments in other things as well. And that's without even mentioning chemical washing of chicken, hormone-fed beef, or GM-modified maize. Because that's the reality of food production in the United States. And that's linked very strongly to welfare, because the reason that the chicken is washed in chemicals, we talk about chlorinated chicken, but there are other chemicals too, is because of poor animal welfare standards. It's because they've got to wash off the feces and the bacteria. It includes things like salmonella that you find on chicken carcasses. Now, until recently, there was a claim made that actually it was perfectly safe. It just was their animal welfare standards that were the problem. But increasingly, the trade unions in America are now pointing out that they've speeded up the production at the cost of safety inspections, which means there's an increased level of danger or threat from food poisoning in chicken, as well as all of the other nasties that I mentioned. Now, the next thing I mentioned was the NHS and public services. There's a thing called negative list systems and ratchet clauses, which mean once a public service has gone into the private sector, if we're party to a trade agreement and a company in a country that's also party to that trade agreement can sue our government and prevent them returning that service to the public sector. So insourcing, bringing some services back in-house is very, very difficult because of that threat of legal challenge. Brings me to workers' rights. Do we want to lose the parental leave? Do we want to lose sick pay? Do we want to lose the level of annual leave that we have in this country? Do we want to lose that protection that makes it very hard for an employer to fire a member of staff? Because that's the reality in America. There's not much in the way of legal protection if you're in a job. That ability to hire and fire, that so-called flexible labour market. I certainly don't want to see that in this country. But again, that could come with an international trade agreement with the United States anyway. And it's worse than that in other countries where trade unions aren't even recognised. And my final point was about climate, the climate crisis, and the ability of companies as part of international trade agreements to sue foreign governments because they're protecting their investments in fossil fuel industries. And if a government like ours wanted to pursue a net zero policy, and I ideally hope our government does what they say they're going to do, and I hope we replace them and actually do it as soon as possible. But even if we do, if we're party to an international trade agreement that makes it difficult to do so, companies in other jurisdictions could sue us and make it much more difficult for our government to pursue green policies. Which brings me on to a couple of other matters. COVID is a huge crisis, a huge challenge, and actually it's international trade that will be a very significant part of the exit from it. We're seeing increasing protectionism during this crisis, and that's something that's got to be overcome. But we're also going to need to get back to the point where we're exporting to boost our economy and the prosperity of the people here, and to get our private sector in particular going again. And when you put that together with the 5 areas I outlined, that's really at the heart of where Labour's international trade policy, I think, needs to go. A very strong agenda around a progressive trading policy to come out of COVID. Very strong social, environmental and health-driven outcomes in our trade policy. And at the same time, just to come back to those figures I started with, that 45% of exports to the European Union and the additional 13% to countries as a result of our membership, and bigger figures for imports overall too. That's why we've got to get a deal with the European Union. And we've got to get a deal that safeguards trade, that safeguards those supply chains in manufacturing, that safeguards the regulatory environment, that ensures we have mutual recognition agreements in our service sectors and allow data flows too. And one of the things Labour is intent on doing is holding the government to the promises they made, that oven-ready deal, that Brexit election, and we've got to make sure that it happens. Okay.
Great, thanks, Bill. So you mentioned the US trade agreement, and obviously it's something that's been in the news quite a lot. Just over the weekend, the government seemed to row back on its promises to not allow chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed meats into the UK after Brexit. It's something which I think is causing a fair amount of division in the Conservative Party and a lot of traditional Conservative voters as well, either in rural constituencies or people concerned about the effect on traditional industries as well, are also concerned about a US deal. And then also, obviously, around the election, there were a number of concerns raised about the NHS and how that could be impacted in a US trade agreement. So I'm interested, just what is Labour's approach specifically to a US deal? Do you think Labour will probably end up opposing the deal if it came before Parliament in a vote? And in what way would it be different if Joe Biden wins in November and we have a different US administration? Does that change Labour's calculations around a US deal, or do you think it'll be a sort of fairly similar policy either way? So sorry, yeah, quite a few questions there, but on the US deal and how Labour might approach it over the next years and months.
Sure, yeah, I mean, you might need to remind me about one or two of those, but let's look at Michael Gove, I know you'd probably rather not, but let's look at what he's said over the years. He told the NFU annual conference, I think it was in 2018, that over his dead body would chlorine-fed washed chicken be allowed into the UK. As Minette Batters, the president of the NFU, said very pointedly at the time, I'd rather have it in ink than in blood. And what we're seeing is a very great reluctance on the part of the government to put it in ink. So their backbenchers who tried to get amendments through the agriculture bill were told, oh no, you don't need to do it here because it's going to be in the trade bill. So they were knocked back on that attempt. And we're going to be told exactly the same thing in the trade bill. In fact, it doesn't really fit in the trade bill because the trade bill is just a very bare bones framework for existing trade agreements. It's got nothing to do with the United States, which is what we're going to be told when we try and, although we will try and put some protections in. So we are very wary of what this trade deal is really about. And we think this trade deal is about mega farms in the United States getting a foothold in the European market via the UK. Because the problem, what they're going to try and do is take over the UK market. I mean, I think they'll really struggle to get from there into the EU, so it's a slightly separate point. But they certainly want to take over our market, as I say, with a view to getting in the EU eventually. But once they're in here with lower standards, because they have these low animal welfare standards, their production costs are lower. And our farmers simply won't be able to compete either on production quality because of animal welfare, or on scale because we have a much smaller scale farming industry, much of it because it's very environmentally focused as well. So you have hill farmers, you have much smaller farms that are, we have a tradition in this country of looking after the land and being environmentally sustainable, which is just anathema to the way that American farming operates. So we think it's about that. The question we keep asking is, what is in it for the UK? And it's very hard to see, other than they might drop the tariffs that are currently on Scottish whisky, which is one of our biggest imports. And it's important, very important, but because it currently has a 25% tariff, which goes back to the Boeing dispute, which you may remember, and he got caught up in it. Retaliation from President Trump. But that is not the answer to the destruction of UK farming. And whatever they may say on the one hand, ministers also will say, well, actually, maybe we'll let this in, but we'll have initially high tariffs so our farmers can get used to the idea of competing with these lower production standard foods. It's just not going to happen because we don't have the economies of scale. And it was a very interesting comment from Penny Mordaunt the other day, the Cabinet Office Minister. And she said, consumers in this country will decide. They will make that choice. Now, if she is being told to say it's down to consumers, it tells you that at some stage, the possibility of lower standard food coming into the country as part of a US trade deal is still very much alive as far as the government is concerned.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So from Labour's perspective, there's obviously these concerns around food, which is, I think, a mixture of environmental concerns, animal welfare concerns, and also public health concerns. And then on top of that, there's the impact on British agriculture, which not only performs better on all of those three fronts, but also obviously employs people and is a key economy in lots of rural areas. So just to understand what you're saying, is the idea that that's an intrinsic part of what the US would push for? So realistically, Labour's always going to oppose a US deal because any deal with the US, they're going to push for these lowering of standards on agri-foods? Or can you envisage a different kind of deal, which maybe Labour would be willing to sign? Because I suppose for lots of people in the country, a US deal is seen as a way of reconfiguring who we trade with after Brexit. And obviously the US is our largest trading partner in terms of, if you don't count the EU as one block, the US is our largest trading partner. And obviously there's lots of close historic and cultural ties between the UK and the US. So I guess you can kind of see where people might be coming from when they're thinking, oh, we really ought to trade more with the US. So is there any kind of deal that Labour would sign up to? And also, as sort of a bracketed question within that, would it make a difference if this were Biden rather than Trump in the White House?
Yeah, well, let's start with, is there a deal we might sign up to? Remember, 19% of our exports with the US, which after the EU bloc is, and it's the largest single country amount of trade that we do. And that's without an international trade deal. So you don't need an agreement to trade. But there are many barriers to reaching an agreement, other than maybe in some minor sector sense, which I think is where we're probably going to end up with the government, because there's not a lot of things that can get agreement on their own side, let alone with us. Because the US is federal. So each state, it's a federal system, so each state determines its own system, which is, so if you look at services, which is the biggest part of our economy, and we are the second biggest trader in services as well as a country, the reality is you have to reach agreement with each individual state. Now, anybody who watches American TV legal programs will recognize if you're an attorney qualified in Chicago, you can't practice in New York, and that's replicated around the country. Well, I think that obviously that applies to somebody from outside of the United States altogether, and that's true in financial services, it's true in law and accountancy as well. And there are variations on that challenge right across the services sectors. We would be interested in some kind of arrangement that would improve access to services, some kind of looking at how you would deliver mutual recognition, what the way in might be there. That's the sort of approach that I think Labour could look at, as well as undoubtedly trying to get rid of these tariffs on things like Scotch whisky. And there's issues around our ceramic sector too, the trade that does export to the United States. But a lot of this is tied up with this dispute between the US and China. It's tied up with Donald Trump's undermining of the rules-based international system, and his refusal to appoint the appellate body, the WTO. So actually, and that's where your question about Biden comes in. Now, Biden will want to get the WTO working again. I think that's where things would be different. He hasn't probably got much of a different domestic agenda when it comes to the kind of deal he might want. He would want American agriculture to do well. But I think the improvement would be around the rules-based system and getting the WTO going. And that's where we would make common cause. And it would certainly be easier for us to be alongside him in addressing how you deal with the challenge of China as a growing trading power.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. So just thinking about, I suppose, kind of what you were just talking about there, the relationship between trade policy and diplomacy, and obviously Trump seems to blur the two quite a lot. And I think, yeah, it seems right that Biden would have quite a different approach, but at the same time, there is this relationship between trade policy and diplomacy. And it seems that the Conservatives, I mean, sort of hesitant to make the case for them, but it seems that they have a fairly well-defined and in some ways quite compelling vision of Britain's place in the world as this sort of buccaneering, ambitious island that's seeking trade deals all around the world. It's not a vision that I particularly sign up to, but I think it's one that is quite appealing to lots of voters. So can Labour offer a sort of compelling vision for what Britain's place in the world is and how that marries up with our trade policy? Because I suppose that the concern is that to lots of voters, it might look like Britain just wants the status quo, wants a close relationship with the EU, maybe isn't thinking so much about the wider world. Whereas it does feel like there's this narrative that the Conservatives can tell about Britain's place in the world. And obviously there's all sorts of problematic links there with Britain's imperial past. But I just wonder what is Labour's vision for Britain's role as a global trading power after Brexit? Is there a story that can be told there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to be optimistic about the future. And this is where talking about supporting our SMEs in particular to trade internationally. Most small firms don't trade internationally. many of those who would like to find it almost impossible to do so. So we can tell a good story about improving financial support for firms that want to export. And we can tell a good story about the very high standards we have in this country and how we're serious about not just defending them, but using them as a basis to set the world's only new independent trade policy, because that's the reality of what we're doing, and doing it in a progressive way. So I think there's an opportunity for Labour to spell out a vision of a trade policy that looks after the jobs and prosperity of people at home, that's linked to our domestic industrial strategy at the same time, and that looks at trade as a way of boosting our prosperity, but doing it in a way that shows leadership to the rest of the world on, especially on areas like the environment and climate, which are a huge opportunity if we invest in them. The green economy, the new technology that is available to us. So if we get this right, if we solve this in the right way, it's an opportunity to say to the British people, trade is actually how we recover from COVID, and how we recover our place in the world. The laugh of it is this talk of global Britain that the Tories use. Their trade policy is anything but, because it's going to be very, very narrow. Putting everything on a deal with Donald Trump, which is just going to undermine what goes on here. It's going to reduce living standards. It's going to see a fall in rights and protections, whether in the workplace or in the environment, as well as undermining consumers. That can't be a good way forward. So we can put forward an alternative to that I think is attractive. And by the way, when they say they want to trade with countries in the Pacific Rim, the amount of trade that could possibly be available from us trading with countries on the far side of the world is tiny in comparison to what's available here. And I think it's also why, whilst we've got to accept, as Keir's been very, very good at saying, well, it's not about leave Remain anymore. That's been settled. We're leaving the European Union. But what is important is that we say this is what we want from a deal. We want to hold the Conservatives to account for what they promised, and what we want is to make the most of the relationship with our nearest neighbours, and not end up with the kind of no deal that we've been warning about all along.
Yeah, and you mentioned China earlier, and I think we've thought a lot about China in the International Policy Group. Obviously, undeniably, China is an important player and an increasingly important player in global trade and geopolitics. But there obviously are big concerns about China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang, and the suppression of political expression in Hong Kong, as well as other political and human rights issues. Some of which, particularly in Hong Kong, the UK has international obligations towards, both particularly in international law. And on top of that, there are these security concerns about allowing Chinese firms to play a large role in our supply chains and our infrastructure, as we saw in the Huawei debate. So what's your sense of, what would you say to those who say that we should be trading less with China, and how does Labour's trade policy towards China tie in with those human rights and foreign policy concerns?
Sorry for the noises off. We may get cats on the call at some point as well. One of them's decided to intervene. Look, I think we've got to be realistic. China is the growing superpower in terms of its military might and trade, and we've got to find a way of accommodating them. I mean, I've heard that question asked to other people, and they said, "Yeah, we've got to do something about China," but we've got to start having some answers. Now, I think it's been encouraging that, to a degree, the government has pushed back fairly firmly on things like Hong Kong. We've been stronger on human rights more widely than that, and that is absolutely right. But we've also got to work with them. We've also got to find a way forward, and we don't want to get stuck in the middle of a trade war between Donald Trump and China either. And I think part of the answer is getting the WTO working again. We've got to align ourselves to the international rules-based system. and we've got to work closely with the EU. So the answers tend to point back to the same sorts of topics each time. Us being a market of 65 million trying to deal with China is not a good place to be. So again, this is where I think we need to make the case that we want to work with China, talk to China, trade with China alongside the EU trading bloc. Now, there's a way of doing that which isn't about, say, refighting the Brexit battles, and that's very important too. But doing it on our own is going to be very difficult, because what tends to happen in international trade deals is when you have a power imbalance, that's how the outcome tends to happen. And we've got a similar problem with America. But China and America, us doing deals with one or other or both of them, we will have to take what they offer us if we want anything. We've got to recognise that. Having said that, I go back to what I said about America. Germany, as an EU member, at the same time as us, did 5 times as much trade with China. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why weren't we doing the trade that Germany was already doing? It is possible to trade without an international trade agreement, and perhaps we should have been doing that. That's become harder for some of the reasons you set out, and because of the trade war going on between the US and China. But I think we should be pursuing that as well. But in the end, it's got to be the global community coming back together, and we've got to resist Donald Trump's attempts to undermine the WTO. And I am worried that some in the Conservative government here are similarly minded. So that's something we've got to watch too.
Sorry, I was on mute. We've got a couple of questions in from the Q&A function. I've just opened it so that people can see the questions that have been asked and also upvote those that they think are more important. But please do begin typing questions if you haven't already. Hopefully, yeah, I mean, we should have time to get through them, but obviously it depends on how many we get. So one in the chat from
Rory.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how to pronounce that. Rory O'Donnell, sorry. How does the Labour Party see trade deals working on a UK-wide basis with regards to Northern Ireland if the protocol to the withdrawal agreement is engaged? So if there are any advantages in new trade deals, will Northern Ireland be left at a competitive disadvantage?
Yeah, I wonder what Rory was doing with himself now, asking awkward questions to me. Yeah, I mean, the Tories have completely gone back on everything they said since the election. I mean, they've thrown Northern Ireland under the bus, having promised they wouldn't. Well, they made a promise they could never keep, and now we are going to have border checks, and we are going to have a border down the Irish Sea, which Boris Johnson said he would never do, and it is an impossible situation, and it is one of the issues. I think our job is to hold the government to account. They promised they wouldn't do this. They made that promise, but we're going to have to keep asking the questions, because there isn't an easy answer to it. Is the truth about it, and I think we're going to need to keep saying that.
So my understanding is that the government wants to have some sort of system of compensation so that Northern Ireland can benefit, maybe on a sort of post hoc basis, from any new trade rules that we have, even though for the purposes of cross-border goods trade, they're in the EU customs union. So is Labour sort of supportive of that, or would Labour sort of try and rewrite the whole thing, or try something different? Because obviously it's a very complex question.
Yeah, well, look, I think the answer to any question of that nature is the Tories won the election. They have an 80-seat majority. They've got to sort it out, and I think our job is to keep scrutinising it, keep challenging it, because there isn't an easy answer, and we've got to listen to people in Northern Ireland. I mean, we now have two SDLP MPs, which we didn't have in the previous 2 parliaments. That they inform our thinking because they're a sister party. in Northern Ireland. But there are no easy answers to this, and I don't know whether that's the right answer in truth. But I think we've got to keep challenging it, and I think we've got to find out from the communities in Northern Ireland what the way forward is.
Yeah,
But sorry, I should say, but underpinning it has got to be peace and security, hasn't it? We've got to keep reminding the government. You keep saying you are committed to the Good Friday Agreement.
No, absolutely, and it's one of those issues which is very much the Tories' own making, and it is intrinsically complex. So
I'd be very interested to know what Rory's answer to his own question was, actually, because he knows a bit more about it than we do.
I don't know if I can make him live, but Rory, feel free to send a message in the chat if you have anything to add on that, or add it to another question, perhaps. So if we just move on to the next question, which comes from Timo Vogler. Sorry again if I'm mispronouncing things. You mentioned protectionism in the context of COVID. I'm thinking about export restrictions affecting trade in PPE or medicine, and vaccines could become an even more worrying problem. Is there a role for free trade agreements in preventing this and in improving pandemic preparedness?
Yeah, there's a number of points there. The UK put in place export restrictions on medicines. It did it actually back in October, November time, before the pandemic was even known about, and then extended them in the pandemic. And one of the consequences of those restrictions are that other countries have restricted their sale of the chemicals that we need to make the medicines, and they've restricted the sale of PPE to us, and they've restricted the sale of the reagents to us. So protectionism in the pandemic has very quickly shown up just how dangerous it can be. I think we should be following the lead of Singapore and New Zealand, who have indicated they will lift the export restrictions as fast as possible. I think we should be saying the same thing, and we have said that. Probably I wrote an article about it, in fact. And the second half of the question was more generally about. Was it more generally about protectionism?
Is the roles of FTA in preventing that sort of protectionism?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it comes back to the rules-based system. If you've got the WTO functioning properly and it's properly respected, and it's got a system that governs these things, that international system helps to limit protectionism. But again, leadership. If we want to progress, if we want to do well, actually, being a country that demonstrates progressive values, that leads by example, and this is a place to do it. And getting that balance between protection and protectionism, by the way, is important, because it's shown up the weakness of our domestic manufacturing capability, and there's definitely space for rebuilding that for future. The question was about future pandemics as well, wasn't it? That is important too. But in the end, if we are developing this new independent trade policy, this is an opportunity for us to show what we can do and encourage others. And then there are plenty of people around the world who want to trade with a country that is demonstrating those sorts of values.
I think another thing is, one thing that we saw as soon as the pandemic hit was that a lot of export restrictions went up immediately, even though you could make a case to say that was in violation of WTO rules or FTAs. So I'm not sure FTAs are a hard and fast defense against countries putting in restrictions when their populations are dying.
No, I agree with that. I think in the pandemic it was it's a very different situation. I mean, New Zealand and Singapore did institute some export restrictions, to be fair to them, but what they've said, the difference is they've said, look, we're only going to keep these as long as we need to keep them.
Yeah. So another question, so this one was sent in the chat, so others may not be able to see it, from James Nixon. How would our approach and preparation differ for either a Trump or Biden presidency, and how we plan to engage? So I suppose similar to the earlier question about Trump and Biden, but particularly in terms of preparation, I think.
Yeah, well, we have to work with, we have to work with whoever's in the White House, unfortunately. And our preference is going to be Biden. But you know, if Trump wins again, it's not good. It's bad news. But we're going to have to find a way of working around it. But at the moment, we're not in government, and our job is to scrutinise and to challenge, and we'll be doing that, and making clear our opposition to the worst deregulation and cuts in rights and standards that the Americans might be pushing on us.
So my understanding is that one area in which the Democrats differ from the Republicans on trade policy, particularly in relation to the UK, is that a lot of Democrats feel a sense of obligation towards Ireland and are concerned about the border on the island of Ireland. And so therefore it's quite likely that they'll want the UK to sort out its EU relationship first. But this is speculation, but it's possible that that would be a priority for them rather than rushing into a trade deal, which I think it would be what Trump would if he won.
Yeah, that's right. And they've made that. I mean, Nancy Pelosi's made that clear that they would veto any kind of trade agreement. Now, does that contradict what I was saying before? Not entirely, because what I think the Americans will try and do is Trump will try and get something where he can wave a piece of paper and Boris Johnson will wave a piece of paper in October, at the end of October, preferably right at the end of October, just close to the American election, so he can say, "Look at me, aren't I great? I've done a deal with Britain," and it might not have very much on it. And actually, that might be why, in the end, it's not cut and dried that we would end up with this doomsday scenario around farming. But I think that's where they're headed, because it's probably what they can get over the line. Now, if he wins again, then I think you end up with a much bigger and more damaging trade agreement. But I think that's what they'll try and do.
Great. We've got a question from Carla Thomas. What will our policy/argument be to support expats, particularly retired UK citizens who are living in the EU? Some people still work and study in the UK and commute to the EU, but they fear that their rights are being obliterated and are understandably concerned that a bad deal or no deal will result in detrimental costs and they will be left with financial difficulties. This includes their access to healthcare. What is the likelihood that we'll be able to maintain the free European health insurance card? So a number of EU-related questions.
Yeah, well, I think it's very unlikely, Carla, and I think health insurance, the free health insurance is going to go. I think there are going to be many things that are going to be very difficult for people, UK nationals living in the EU. Apart from anything else, just the reluctance of the UK government to do any kind of deal. But these are wrapped up in the sorts of things that were promised. These are wrapped up in the need for the government to deliver on what it said around its oven-ready deal. And whilst they're not probably the things that we would necessarily have front and centre, what we would have more front and centre is the ability of EU nationals to live and work in the UK, for their families to have residence here and have guarantees there. And it's taken the government an awfully long time to give those guarantees. And frankly, unless the UK government is prepared to negotiate in good faith, I think it's very difficult to see how UK citizens living in the EU 27 are going to be looked after. So it will be part of what we will be trying to hold the government to account for over the next few months.
And what are the opportunities for that in Parliament exactly? Because I know that there was a lot of back and forth about how much say Parliament would have over the withdrawal process. And obviously that led to things like the prorogation of Parliament and the election. Over the next few months, obviously the deadline for agreeing a deal is approaching pretty quickly. What can Labour actually do in the Commons?
Well, we have very little power. I mean, the Tories can vote through anything they want with an 80-seat majority, but there's also the very, very important issue, which is picked up by the trade bill, that our process for agreeing international treaties is wholly undemocratic, where the executive does all the negotiating in secret. The negotiating texts are not shared with MPs. There's very little scrutiny of it by committees. I mean, there's a little bit of a concession there around select committees being able to look at things, but with the EU deal, we're not being told what's in the text at all. And the Europeans have a much better idea, but I think we've insisted that the Europeans can't look at share it either, which is bizarre, because normally they have a much more open process. We've lost the process we used to have as members of the EU, where the European Parliament did proper scrutiny, where the European Parliament's own committee scrutinised negotiating texts. But whether it's EU or US, or indeed the agreements that we're looking at in the trade bill, which are the existing agreements, which we're moving which we're moving from being part of as members of the EU to being to re-signing in our own right. The whole process is really undemocratic, where all that happens is the government has to lay the final product in Parliament and give Parliament 21 days in which it can vote against it. Can't amend it, you can vote against it, and then they just lay it again and win. And in practice, the only time you can do that is with an opposition day debate. And there are times when you don't get an opposition day debate in a 21-day period, which we experienced in the last Parliament. But frankly, we're not going to win the vote anyway because they've got an 80-seat majority. So there's no sign. I mean, I'll spend a little bit longer on this. No sign of proper scrutiny, and it is fraught with danger when you don't scrutinise, when you rush these things. I'll just give you a couple of recent examples. Two of the agreements that have gone through already, where we've moved from being part of them as members of the EU to signing them as the UK, are with South Korea and Switzerland. And the Swiss one, because they rushed it, because they didn't have experts looking at it, they've missed elements in it that mean UK manufacturers providing components to Swiss manufacturers, they can't be used if that Swiss manufacturer wants to sell into the EU because of something called rules of origin. And a similar thing has gone wrong with the sale of UK-made steel to EU manufacturers who sell into South Korea. So Mercedes can't now use UK steel, which makes up 4% of their cars, when it sells to South Korea. So UK steel manufacturers have lost that market entirely. And it's quite a significant market, Mercedes being a luxury car. It's very popular in South Korea. And that is wholly down to a lack of scrutiny, a lack of expertise, and very poor negotiating capacity. And we're going to see this time and time again. And I dread to think what they'll come up with for any kind of EU deal they do manage to come up with, because they're just not allowing those like David, who knows a thing or two about this sort of stuff, to get involved in it. Or they're not letting the unions, they're not letting the employers' organisations, and they're not letting elected representatives look at these things either. And those two mistakes already, I'm afraid, suggest real trouble for us. And as I said right at the start, the problem is what goes into these agreements overrides domestic law. And once you've got an international trade agreement, very difficult to undo it, because both parties need to agree to change it.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning these are often sort of 500-page documents, which you can't expect MPs to, I mean...
It's not an overnight job, is it?
Yeah, they have 21 days and, MPs work very hard, I'm sure. It's not much time to scrutinise. And there's one part of scrutiny is about being able to kick the deal back or say no to it. But there's also this other part, which is just about transparency and knowing what's being discussed and what's being negotiated. And as we saw with the TTIP negotiations, so the big EU-US agreement that was proposed, one of the big annoyances for lots of campaign organizations and I think lots of the general public was just that all of this was being done in secret. So regardless of whether MPs have a say over it, it's just all very secretive behind closed doors. And that I think came up again in the leaked documents discussion around the time of the election.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, TTIP in the end, because it had a slightly greater level of scrutiny because it was an EU process, did fall apart because of these concerns about it's a thing called the Investor State Disputes Settlement Mechanism, the so-called ISDS. And in the end, people were able to get hold of the negotiating text, spot the problems, and see that this was a lawyer's charter for suing governments over changes in domestic policy that affected the profits of large multinationals who would have been based in America. And we had similar problems with CETA, which were taken out. There are some problems still with CETA, but it's nothing like as bad as it was. But that the European system had a degree of scrutiny. There isn't even that with the UK one that's being envisaged and that we are setting up in the trade bill, because by the time you get to it being laid in Parliament, you can't change it. You can just have a vote on it, and there's not even the chance of proper debate on it. It's just straight to the vote, and that is not a good place to be. It's a 90-minute debate and then vote, and then if you lose, and then even if you win, they can do it again. I don't have to change it. So it is a ludicrous situation.
No, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I was just gonna go to another question. We do have more time, so if people want to add some more questions to Q&A, then please do. This one's from Laura De Souza. Sorry again if I'm pronouncing that wrong. What remedies will be in place if trade counterparts renege on trade deals? So will this be purely dealt with within the clauses of a ratified trade agreement, e.g. some form of arbitration clauses, or will we be able to approach a supranational trade governing body like the WTO?
Well, I'd like to think we could approach the WTO, but the WTO is barely functioning at the moment. I mean, there are still things happening there, but because the US has pulled the plug on it, it's very difficult. So it's become, international trade is moving to the edge where it becomes just the law of the Wild West, which is what Donald Trump and other extreme free marketeers want. But it's a very dangerous place to be. So at the moment, it's a precarious situation. I mean, I think this American presidential election is going to be absolutely crucial in changing this. But I mean, it doesn't solve everything, but at least it does have the chance of stabilising the WTO and the international rules-based system and some kind of appellant system.
Yeah, there's also an issue there with our tariff schedule, because normally one of the ways that you would respond if a party didn't keep to the terms of a trade agreement is you'd introduce tariffs, or you'd use some sort of sanction, trade-related sanction. But the UK set its general tariffs so low, so the ones that are to member states that we don't have an agreement with, that it's much harder to use those as any kind of leverage in FTAs as well. And they've done that because they know the effects of Brexit will be bad, so they've slashed tariffs for general trade partners, non-FTA ones. But the effect of that is you lose a lot of leverage over which you would normally need for FTAs.
Yeah, you do. And the Canadians in particular have said, because remember we've got to re-sign our deal with Canada because we left the EU. The Canadians say, well, you've already given them everything they want with low tariffs because they can export to us very easily. But the other problem with this is that the government says their priority is consumers and low prices. So they want to suck in cheap imports with low tariff. Well, what's the impact of that where you've got domestic manufacturing? It undermines it and it wipes it out. And so there's a real threat to jobs and our economy domestically of this low tariff policy, as well as in some of the international problems with it. They're very unbalanced because they have this, they call it an economic interest test, and it's very consumer oriented. And our argument is you've got to balance the needs of the producer in manufacturing, both the employer and the union side, alongside that of the consumer. I mean, in the end, workers are consumers, so it's a counterproductive policy because you undermine your economy overall. I mean, I just add to that point. Again on consultation, there's a body called the Trade Remedies Authority, which hasn't been formally set up as part of the trade bill again, and they do not want representation on that either from employers or unions. They don't want representation from the Scottish, Welsh or Northern Ireland governments either, who all have slightly different takes on their interests on international trade. And again, it's profoundly undemocratic, and it gives the Secretary of State enormous powers on appointments and on the final decision. And there's a lack of scrutiny because they don't share the details of the investigations that the Trade Remedies Authority, which has been up and running within the department until it's formally set up, so we know what it's like. They don't share them with the unions particularly, and they don't share all of it with the employers or the devolved administrations. And so it's another area where there's a real power grab by the government, and another example of just how they've got I think they do understand it, but they just run it very, very badly.
So we've got a couple more questions. So one from Liz May. Would Labour consider developing a new holistic approach towards Africa that moves away from the global Britain/imperial approach of the Tories, where we extract resources, and instead support regional value addition and pan-Africanism?
Yeah, I mean, supporting the Sustainable Development Goals has been at the heart of our policy both in international development and in international trade for a long time. And one of the things that I was very pleased to be involved when Barry Gardiner was the Shadow Secretary of State was something called Just Trading, which looks at how this country, and again there's opportunity with this potential for setting up an international trade, an independent trading policy, can really live values of progressive trade, of fair trade in its widest sense, not just free trade, using the opportunities in, particularly in the low carbon economy, to promote sustainable trade with the developing world, encourage their economies to develop, and encourage self-sufficiency, combining trade and aid to deliver to those goals. And it's exactly what the Sustainable Development Goals have called for many years. And again, coming out of the pandemic, the economies in the developing world are going to be even much harder hit. I think it's important. It's very easy to forget that bad those things are here. There's parts of the world where the collapse of the economy, when people are already in poverty, is far, far more serious than we could even imagine. So, I think we are duty bound to pursue this agenda. And again, it's about leadership. If we are demonstrating that we have the ideas to drive this agenda forward, then others will come with us. Incidentally, there's an economic benefit to us doing it, because we can develop our own industries in areas like renewable energy, where we're strong, to help those parts of the world off-grid, for example, in wind energy, and even places where off-grid in tidal energy as well in the developing world, and in transport and in agriculture. So I absolutely agree with the point, but and it's a strand that we are very interested in.
Great, thank you.
I know it's something that's very much part of the work you do, David. So you probably should have been answering that question rather than me.
No, I mean, yeah, I agree with everything you said, and yeah, I think also Liz, who asked the question, is with Tradecraft, so I think she's also pretty qualified to answer the question too. But, great. So we've got one more from Robert Owens. There have been many opinion pieces recently, including the FT, saying that a no deal with the EU is now more likely, as the government feel that the disruption from lockdown and coronavirus could dilute and mask the economic cost. Given the Tories' present majority and their belief that Keir Starmer's political weakness is his past support for a second referendum, how might the Labour Party respond if there is indeed no deal with the EU?
Well, we can't stop the Tories doing anything they want to do. But I think the important thing politically and economically and socially and environmentally is that we hold them to account, because there are Tories who are worried about these things. Not every Tory is the out-and-out free marketeer that Dominic Raab is or Michael Gove is. So I think we have to hold them to account on what they promised. We have to hold them to account on the need to look after manufacturing and services by having the close relationships and the agreements in place on supply chains, on mutual recognition, on data, and on the areas like the ability to have leave to permanent leave to stay and residents in the UK. So I think that's the way to push this, rather than us saying the government must take longer. I think we've got to say, look, you promised these things. You tell us how you're going to deliver them. You've got an 80-seat majority. You can do what you want, but you've made all these promises. Now get on and make it happen. Now, if that takes longer, that's up to them. They've made a mess of it. They should have made that promise in the first place. But we can't make that happen. They want us to bang on, by the way, and you see it. You saw it again from Michael Gove today. He's talking about about this issue of extending transition, because he wants us to say you should extend the transition. We're interested in the outcomes. We're interested in the results. We're interested in getting this right. They want it to be about process, so they can say it's all Labour's fault. It's all the fault of the EU, and it's all the fault of COVID. Nothing to do with us. It's all about, for them, it's all about blame. We've got to make it about outcomes and about calling for what the end result should be.
Great, thanks a lot. And I've got another one from Rory. What impact could the change at the top of the WTO mean for the UK? And should the UK have tried to put forward a candidate for the position if the aim is to amplify the UK's global trade influence and influence the rules-based order after Brexit?
I'm not sure the UK putting forward a candidate for the head of the WTO is a terribly good idea, because we've tarnished our reputation so badly because of the way we've handled Brexit. So I think we are a little short on friends to support that person. But I think we should absolutely be making the case. I think we should absolutely be supporting those who want to return to that system. I think as a party we should do that. My concern is that we are increasingly seeing an attitude in government, whether it's Dominic Raab or Michael Gove or quite a few others in the cabinet, who are quite happy to go down the Donald Trump line of undermining that rules-based system. So I think as a party we should continue. I mean, I had a meeting with the S&D group yesterday. We should continue to work with our partners in progressive parties around the world to not just re-establish, but to enhance the strength and role, and frankly update the role of the WTO, because the WTO is very much an economic entity. I think it needs to take social and environmental value on board as well. That's something I've been looking at in the trade bill, and I'll be talking about that in some of the amendments we move.
Great, we'll look out for those next week.
Yeah.
And another one from Carla Thomas. Only 19.3% of people with disabilities were employed in the US in 2019. Internationally, 20% of a billion disabled people are employed globally. In the post-Brexit, post-COVID world, what is the likelihood that people with disabilities will be severely impacted? And even though Labour can champion the impact, what agenda can we pursue to frustrate unfair practices?
Yeah, well, again, this is about making the right comments, raising the right amendments and things like the trade bill, asking the right questions of MPs here, discussing them with our partners around the world, and saying, look, it's not acceptable that we have an agenda that discriminates against people with disabilities. And people with disabilities are a very important potential asset in an economy, as well as being individuals in their own right. So there's a moral case for supporting disabled people, but there's also an economic one. Very many people with disabilities can contribute massively. Now, Carly, you mentioned the United States. Ironically, the Small Business Administration in America has a program which supports getting people with disabilities to help them set up their own business. Now, it's only one aspect of what's needed. I'd like to see, I've been championing the idea of having our own version of that for a long time. It's something I like to do domestically, but I think that the championing of people with disabilities, it should be very much at the heart of good social value in international trade, as well as domestically. So it is. I think it's going to be one of the amendments that we tabled to the trade bill as a specific area that we want the government to pay attention to. So very much on our agenda.
Great, and I haven't got any more questions on Zoom, so if anyone has any final things that they didn't get to ask, then please do type those up. There was one on Facebook from Steve Bibbing. Great discussion, guys. As we know, the government this week has started trade negotiations with Japan. What are the big issues and opportunities for Japanese trade going forward? And secondly, are there any countries or groups of countries you would like the government to negotiate with more urgently? And where are the areas that present the most opportunity? So Japan, and what are the priorities apart from Japan?
Yeah, well, the priority should be Europe, because they're our neighbours and they're our biggest market. And whether you're in business or you're running a country, you should look after your existing economic opportunities first. Without that, it's very difficult to do other deals, and it's also very difficult to get a good deal with Japan without having a deal with the EU. And the Japanese, what the Japanese investors are looking for, Nissan being a prime example, is for the UK to do a deal with the EU, so that their investment in the UK in cars pays off, because they can still have full market access to the EU. Because going back to your point about tariffs, David, at the moment, the tariff schedule that the UK has set, whilst it's low in some places, is 10.5% on cars, and that is the same as it will be for the EU to import from the UK. So a Japanese-made car here has 10.5% put on it to go into the EU. Well, that's not going to happen. They'll just pull the plug on their investments here. So it's imperative we get a deal with Japan to protect jobs in the car industry here, and in other Japanese-owned industries. They want us to do that deal, and they want that market access into the EU. So the two questions do go together very close, very well.
Great. So I haven't got any more questions on the Q&A. So if anyone has a final burning question, then please do post it. I just had one about the environment, which is obviously very high on the agenda for lots of us on the left and the Labour Party. And the UK is hoping to host the next COP conference. And obviously the previous, the May government set the ambition of net zero by 2050. So I'm interested in how does this relate to our trade policy? What role does trade have in fighting the climate crisis? I know you mentioned it briefly earlier. Are there specific mechanisms that can be used in trade agreements, or specific things that we ought to avoid in trade agreements as a way of tackling the climate crisis?
Yes, and an international trade agreement should have a low carbon agenda at its heart. What I mean by that is that there should be a presumption that we're going to favour carbon neutral. Cat problems again, sorry. Let's see the cat reading. There should be a presumption that we are encouraging low carbon manufacturing. We are encouraging a reduction in the use of fossil fuels in travel in trade as a consequence of imports and exports. And oh, I mean, actually, one of the consequences of the lockdown has been we do more of this. Well, you know, we should carry on doing more of this, actually, as an aside. But that should be written in. That should be hardwired into international trade agreements. That there is this presumption that both parties to the agreement are meeting their climate commitments at the heart of everything they do.
No, yeah, absolutely. Great. Okay. Well, I think we'll probably leave it there then, unless. Oh no, wait. Sorry, there was one more question. We'll take this as the last one from Laura D'Souza again. Will there be a race to the bottom for or an erosion of human rights and employment rights in the UK as the UK strives to remain competitive economic advantage? I can imagine this happening if human rights legislation is gradually stripped back in favour of economic priorities to better compete in the global marketplace.
Well, that's what we've got to try and avoid, and that's why we are working very hard with the trade unions to highlight the threat of the kind of deal that the current American government might like to do with us. If we have US-style labour rights in the UK, that's very bad news for anybody in work now. And we cannot afford a race to the bottom. I completely agree with that. We have to compete on the basis of high quality, and that means high standards to attract investors here on the basis of very strong values, not on weak values. And actually, I think there's a real appetite around the world for that kind of engagement. There'll be pressures to undermine it, not least because of the crisis. That is absolutely true. But I think we've got to resist them, and coming out of it, we've got to encourage the higher standards. And actually, one way of doing this is to keep quoting Conservative ministers at their own words. So when they said, we want to have higher standards in the EU, okay, go on then, get on with it. And that's the kind of approach I think we're going to adopt, because unless we're vigilant, I'm afraid the race to the bottom is what we'll end up with, and that absolutely is something we must resist.
Great, thanks so much, Bill. That was really helpful and interesting. So, obviously a very broad subject area as trade is, but I think we got a really good flavour of the various ways in which Labour's holding the government to account as the UK adopts a new trade policy. The video is online, I believe. It's on Facebook, on the Young Fabians page. It's also been recorded here on Zoom, so it should be available to share on social media if you missed some of it or if you want to watch it back. I would encourage you to like the Fabian International Policy Group and Young Fabians on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We have a Facebook group as well, which you can join if you'd like to be more involved with that. We'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Bill, for joining, for taking the time out of your busy parliamentary schedule. And all. Well,
it's just so it's in passing, David. I'm sat here at home again, which is where I was working all day, every day for 10 weeks. And I went down to Parliament this week for the first time. A very, very strange experience. And I've been doing my appearances in Parliament, sat in this very chair with this backdrop. On Tuesday, I went in the chamber and spoke. It was quite disorienting to go back to something approaching normal. But I think this is, actually working from home, which is what I was doing. It works. It's not perfect, but it does work. And I think, one of the things I had a conversation with one of the business groups today. I just say it's in the evening. They found that more businesses have been able to start international trade during lockdown than they expected because of this kind of technology, because they haven't had to organise trade missions and go and visit. Now, it's a relatively small sum, a relatively small amount of trade, but businesses who are starting up have managed to start making contacts and winning orders in services anyway, a little bit in manufacturing, because of the use of technology. So we've changed the way of working, I suspect, forever. And that's a good thing again, from a carbon footprint point of view, but it could be quite a productive thing. So out of a crisis comes an opportunity sometimes. I say that with the deepest of understanding for everybody whose loved ones have died. But we all recognise that. But maybe the way of working has really changed, and maybe it's about time.
No, yeah, absolutely.
And thank that's what I was going to say. Thank you very much for hosting tonight, and thank you everyone who's joined us.
Yeah,
so
thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Bill. To anyone watching, our link to the Facebook page is just in the chat. So if you want to get more updates and things like that, please do give us a like. And thank you so much, Bill, for such brilliant insight, and to David for chairing.
Do you have any events that we want to plug while we're on the line?
So we're organising one with John Ashworth MP, Shadow Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, but the date isn't entirely confirmed. So it's proposed 17th, 7 p.m. And as soon as we've got that confirmed, we'll send that out in an email.
Great.
Great. So that's everything for me. So I'm going to hop off. Thank you so much, both.
Thanks, everyone.
Cecilia, thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.